I still wake up at the same time. Nothing about that changed. The alarm goes off, I reach for it, and for a second everything feels normal. It's quiet in that way mornings always used to be, no tension, no noise, just the low hum of the house settling into the day. But then I remember. And it's not a sharp realization. It doesn't hit all at once. It just settles in, like something already waiting there before I even opened my eyes. The house feels different now. Not empty. Not loud. Just, off. Like I'm in a place I used to belong to. I still move through the same routines. Same kitchen. Same coffee mug. Same chair at the table. But there's this constant awareness that none of it feels like mine anymore. Not really. Even small things don't sit right. The way the light hits the counter. The way the silence stretches too long. I notice things I never used to notice, and I can't stop noticing them. It's like I'm a guest in my own life. I don't think that feeling started all at once. It wasn't some dramatic shift where everything broke in a single moment. Looking back, it was quieter than that. Smaller. There was a point, one I didn't recognize at the time, where something changed. It wasn't proof. Not even close. Just, a moment. Something so ordinary I almost ignored it. I remember standing there, not even fully paying attention, when I noticed it. A detail that didn't line up the way it should have. A timing that felt slightly off. A reaction that didn't quite match the situation. Nothing I could point to and say, that's it. If anything, I told myself it didn't matter. It's probably nothing, I remember thinking. And I believed that. Or at least, I wanted to. Because the alternative meant questioning something I wasn't ready to question. So I let it go. At least, I thought I did. But something had already shifted. It's hard to explain how fast that happens. 1 second you feel steady, like everything is where it's supposed to be. And then there's this tiny crack, barely visible, but once you see it, you can't stop seeing it. I started paying attention in ways I hadn't before. Not intentionally. Not at first. Just, noticing. Little pauses in conversation. Small inconsistencies. The kind of things that don't prove anything on their own, but start to stack up in your head without you realizing it. And the worst part is, nothing outwardly changes. The routines stay the same. The words sound the same. Life keeps moving exactly the way it always has. But underneath that, something feels different. Unstable. I didn't confront anything. I didn't ask questions. I didn't even fully admit to myself what I was starting to feel. I just crossed a line I didn't know existed. The kind you can't step back over. Because once you notice something is wrong, even if you can't explain why, you don't get to go back to not knowing. And I think that's when it really began. Not when I found out. Not when everything fell apart. But right there, in that small, forgettable moment I almost ignored. That was the first time I realized I might not understand my own life as well as I thought I did. And once that thought settled in, it never really left. If this opening pulled you in, make sure you subscribe to the channel. These stories go deeper than they seem at first, and the ones that feel quiet in the beginning usually end up hitting the hardest. Like the video if you've ever had a moment like this, where something felt off before you had the words for it, and share it with someone who might recognize that feeling too. When I think back to how it started, nothing about it felt unusual. If anything, it felt efficient. We fell into things quickly, but not in a chaotic way. It just made sense. She was organized, decisive, always a step ahead. I liked that about her. I trusted it. I didn't have to overthink things when she was around. She handled problems before they became problems. Early on, it showed up in small ways. Booking things, planning ahead, keeping track of details I would have forgotten. I remember joking once that she had her life mapped out, and she just smiled like that was a compliment. And it was. At the time, it felt like I was lucky. The first time she suggested handling something bigger, it didn't raise any alarms. It came up casually, like it was the most logical thing in the world. "I'm just better with numbers," she said. It wasn't dismissive. It didn't feel like a criticism. Just a statement. And she was right, at least from what I could tell. So I agreed. At first, it was just one thing. Then another. Bills, accounts, paperwork. Things I never really cared about managing anyway. It felt like we were dividing responsibilities in a way that worked. She took on more, and I let her. Not because I had to. Because it made life easier. There was a point where our money stopped feeling separate, but not in a concerning way. It just felt like we were building something together. Consolidating things. Streamlining. "That way we don't have to keep track of everything twice," she said once. Again, it made sense. And I didn't question it. I think that's the part that's hard to explain now. There wasn't a moment where I felt like I was giving something up. It never felt like losing control. It felt like trust. Like partnership. Over time, I stopped checking things altogether. Not intentionally. It just faded out of my routine. I didn't need to think about it anymore. She had it covered. If I needed something, I'd ask. It wasn't a big deal. At least, that's how it felt then. There were moments, small ones, where something didn't sit perfectly right. Times when I'd ask a simple question and get a short answer, or no real answer at all. "Don't worry about it," she'd say. Or, "I already handled it." And I'd let it go. Because why wouldn't I? Nothing was falling apart. There were no obvious issues. Life was stable. Predictable, even. And I liked that. I think I got used to not needing to know everything. Got comfortable with the idea that she knew better in certain areas, and that it was okay for me to step back. It wasn't forced. It wasn't demanded. It just happened. Looking back, I can see how gradual it was. How each small decision built on the last one. But at the time, there was no sense of anything shifting. No warning. Just this quiet transition from sharing responsibility to handing it over. And the more that happened, the less I thought about it. I trusted her. Completely. If something came up, I assumed she'd already taken care of it. If I didn't understand something, I figured it wasn't something I needed to understand. That was the arrangement. Unspoken, but clear. And it worked. At least, it looked like it did. Because by the time I realized how much had changed, I couldn't remember when it stopped being a choice. At some point, I stopped thinking of it as her handling things, and just accepted that things were handled. I didn't keep track of accounts anymore. I didn't log into anything. If I needed to check something, I'd ask. Most of the time, I didn't even think to. It became normal. If I wanted to buy something bigger, I'd mention it first. Not because I felt like I needed permission, at least not consciously. It just felt practical. Like keeping things aligned. She always had an answer. "We're tight this month. Wait until next week. I'll move things around." Sometimes she explained. Sometimes she didn't. Either way, I trusted that she knew what she was doing. There were moments, though, where that trust didn't feel as steady as it used to. I remember asking about something small once, nothing important. Just trying to understand where things were at. She looked at me for a second, like I'd asked the wrong question. "It's handled," she said. Not harsh. Not angry. Just closed. I nodded and dropped it. That became a pattern. Not arguments. Not even disagreements. Just these small dead ends where the conversation stopped before it really started. And I adjusted to that. It was easier not to push. Easier to assume there was a reason I didn't need to know. She'd proven herself enough times that questioning it felt unnecessary. Or maybe uncomfortable. I'm not sure which one it was. Over time, I stopped asking altogether. If something didn't make sense, I told myself it would eventually. If I felt unsure, I reminded myself that everything was working, wasn't it? Nothing was falling apart. The bills were paid. The house was stable. Life looked exactly the way it was supposed to look from the outside. So I stopped measuring my own understanding of things. I didn't need to know the details. That's what I told myself. But there were other moments, too. Not about money. About tone. Little comments that didn't sit right. You worry too much. Just let me deal with it. Or sometimes, a slight shift in the way she said things. Like I was overcomplicating something simple. I'd catch it for a second, that feeling. Like I'd been talked down to. And then it would pass. Because it wasn't constant. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't enough to build an argument around. Just, there. Easy to ignore. So I ignored it. Looking back, I think that's when the balance really changed. Not when she took on more responsibility, but when I stopped pushing back at all. When I stopped needing to understand. I started deferring without thinking about it. Letting her decide what mattered, what didn't, what I needed to know and what I didn't. It wasn't discussed. It didn't have to be. It just became the way things worked. And the more it settled in, the harder it became to imagine doing things differently. Because I wouldn't have known where to start. If I wanted to access something, I didn't always know how. If I wanted to change something, I didn't know what the process even looked like anymore. That part crept up on me slowly. Not enough to alarm me at first. Just enough to make me pause. To realize that certain things weren't really in my hands anymore. Not directly. I still had my job. My routine. My role. But the structure underneath all of it, the part that actually held everything together, that wasn't mine. And I think, somewhere in the back of my mind, I understood that. I just didn't let myself sit with it long enough to ask what it meant. It's strange how long you can sit with a feeling before you're willing to call it what it is. At first, it wasn't even suspicion. That word feels too strong for what it actually was. It was more like hesitation. A pause where there didn't used to be one. Things didn't line up the way they used to. Not in obvious ways. Nothing I could point to and say, this is wrong. Just small gaps. Moments where something felt slightly out of sync. She started coming home later some nights. Not consistently. Not enough to create a pattern. Just often enough that I noticed it. When I asked, the answers were simple. Work ran over. Stopped somewhere on the way back. It always sounded reasonable. And I didn't press. There was no reason to, at least not one I could explain. But I started noticing how quickly those answers came. Like they were already prepared before I asked. Again, not proof of anything. Just, something. There were other things too. Subtle shifts I couldn't quite name at the time. The way she'd check her phone and angle it slightly away without thinking. Not dramatically. Not like she was hiding it. Just enough that I became aware of it. Or the way conversations started to feel shorter. Less open. I'd say something, and she'd respond, but without really engaging. Like she was somewhere else, even when she was right in front of me. You're quiet, I said once. I'm just tired, she replied. And maybe she was. That's the problem with moments like that. There's always a reasonable explanation. Always a way to tell yourself you're overthinking it. So I did. I kept everything to myself. Didn't bring it up. Didn't want to sound paranoid or insecure over things that didn't even qualify as real concerns. But the feeling didn't go away. It just grew. Slowly. I started paying attention more than I used to. Not deliberately at first. Just being aware in a way I hadn't been before. The timing of things. The tone of her voice. The gaps between what she said and what I felt. There were moments where I'd catch myself replaying something she said hours later, trying to figure out why it stuck with me. Most of the time, I couldn't. It just didn't feel right. And I didn't like that. Because I didn't have anything concrete to hold on to. No evidence. No clear sign that something was actually wrong. Just a collection of small, disconnected moments that refused to settle. It made me question myself more than anything else. Maybe I was reading too much into things. Maybe I'd just gotten used to everything being predictable, and this was just normal variation. People change. Routines shift. That doesn't mean anything is broken. I told myself that more than once. But there were times when the doubt flipped. When, for a second, I wondered if I wasn't questioning enough. That maybe I'd been too comfortable for too long. Too willing to accept things at face value. Those thoughts didn't stay long. They weren't fully formed yet. But they showed up. And once they did, they didn't disappear completely. They lingered in the background. I started noticing how easily she dismissed certain things. If I asked something slightly off script, the conversation would close quickly. It's nothing. You're overthinking it. Not harsh. Not confrontational. Just enough to end the discussion. And I let it end. Every time. Because I didn't have the footing to push further. I didn't have anything solid to stand on. Just a feeling. And a feeling isn't enough to accuse someone of anything. So I stayed quiet. But staying quiet didn't bring back the certainty I used to have. If anything, it made the distance more noticeable. Everything on the surface stayed the same. Same routines, same conversations, same shared space. But underneath that, something had shifted. I could feel it, even if I couldn't explain it. And that was the part that got to me the most. Not knowing what was wrong. Just knowing that something was. I think that's when I crossed into something different. Not suspicion exactly. But awareness. The kind that makes you pay attention to things you used to ignore. The kind that changes how you listen, how you look, how you interpret everything. And once that switch flips, you don't really get to turn it off again. The moment itself wasn't dramatic. No confrontation. No shouting. No sudden collapse of everything I thought I knew. It was quiet. Almost disappointingly quiet. I remember sitting there, looking at something I hadn't meant to find. Not searching, not digging. Just, there. In front of me. Clear enough that I couldn't explain it away. For a second, I tried. I actually did. I remember thinking, there's probably another explanation. Something reasonable. Something that would make everything go back to how it was 5 minutes before. But it didn't take long for that to fall apart. Because the more I looked at it, the more it stopped being a question. And started becoming an answer. It wasn't one detail. It was how everything connected. All those small moments I'd been carrying around without understanding them, they suddenly lined up. The late nights. The distance. The way conversations closed before they really began. It all fit. Too cleanly. I didn't feel anger right away. That's something I always thought I would feel first. Instead, it was this strange kind of stillness. Like my brain slowed everything down just enough for me to process it piece by piece. I remember thinking, this has been happening for a while. Not as a guess. As a realization. And that's what hit the hardest. Not just what I was seeing in that moment, but what it meant about everything that came before it. All the times I didn't question something. All the times I let something go because it didn't feel important enough to push. None of it was random. None of it was harmless. It had structure. That's the word I keep coming back to. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't something that slipped through the cracks or happened once and spiraled. It had been built. Maintained. Protected. And I had been standing right in the middle of it without understanding what I was actually part of. I sat there longer than I probably should have. Not doing anything. Not reacting. Just absorbing it. Trying to figure out what I was supposed to do with it. Because knowing something like that doesn't immediately tell you what comes next. It just changes everything that came before. I thought about confronting her. I really did. But even that felt complicated. Not because I doubted what I'd seen. But because I didn't fully understand what confronting it would actually change. Would she deny it? Would she explain it in a way that somehow made sense? Or would she just not care? That last thought stayed with me longer than the others. Because, looking back, there had been signs of that too. Not guilt. Not fear of being caught. Just a kind of quiet confidence that nothing was really at risk. And sitting there, with everything finally clear, I started to understand why. It wasn't just that something had been hidden from me. It was that it had been hidden around me. Like I was the only one who didn't have the full picture. And now that I did, I couldn't unsee it. I couldn't go back to trusting the same way. Couldn't go back to assuming things were what they seemed. That version of things was gone. And the strangest part was, nothing around me had physically changed. Same house. Same space. Same life on the surface. But underneath it, everything felt different. Like I was standing in a place that looked familiar, but wasn't built for me anymore. I didn't say anything that night. I didn't bring it up. I just carried it with me. And the more I thought about it, the more one question kept coming back. Not why did this happen? But how long had I been the only one who didn't know? If you've made it this far, take a second to subscribe to Cheating Stories with Ray. Stories like this don't unfold all at once, and the deeper they go, the more they make you question what you think you'd do in the same situation. Drop a like if this part hit you, and leave a comment. At what point would you have confronted it, or would you have waited like I did? I didn't act on it right away. That's the part people don't really understand when they hear something like this. They assume there's a moment where everything becomes clear, and then you just leave. But it doesn't work like that. Knowing something and being able to do something about it are two completely different things. For a while, I just carried it. I watched her the same way she'd always moved through the house. Calm. Unbothered. Nothing in her behavior suggested anything had changed. Because for her, it hadn't. That was the first thing I had to come to terms with. This wasn't new for her. It was only new for me. I started thinking about what leaving would actually look like. Not emotionally. Practically. And that's when things started to feel different. Heavier. I realized I didn't know where anything actually stood. Not in detail. I didn't know what accounts were where. What was in my name, what wasn't. What I had access to, what I didn't. That hadn't mattered before. Now it did. I remember sitting down one night, trying to piece it together in my head. Just going through what I knew. It didn't take long before I hit gaps. Big ones. Things I should have known, but didn't. I tried to check something, simple, something that should have been straightforward, and realized I didn't even have the information I needed to do that. Not the login. Not the access. Nothing. That's when it started to click in a way it hadn't before. This wasn't just about trust. This was about control. And I hadn't noticed how much of it I'd given up. The next day, I brought something up. Not directly about what I knew. Just, testing the ground. I was thinking about separating some things, I said. Just to keep track of my own stuff. She didn't even look surprised. If anything, she looked amused. Why? She asked. Just feels like I should, I said. Have a better idea of where things are. She leaned back slightly, like she was considering whether the conversation was worth having. You already know where things are, she said. They're handled. It was the same phrase. The same tone. But this time, it landed differently. I'd still like access, I said. There was a pause. Not long. Just enough to make it clear that something had shifted. Access to what? She asked. The question sounded simple, but it wasn't. Because I didn't have a clean answer. Everything I could think of led back to the same problem. I didn't know what I didn't know. I just mean, everything, I said finally. That's when she smiled. Not warmly. Not reassuringly. Just, knowingly. With what? She asked. I didn't respond right away. Because I understood what she meant. And she knew I understood. With what are you going to separate anything? She continued. Everything's already set up. The way she said it wasn't defensive. It wasn't even aggressive. It was matter of fact. Like she was pointing out something obvious that I hadn't thought through. I felt it then. Not just the betrayal. The position I was in. My income goes somewhere, I said. It goes where it needs to go, she replied. For us. That word, us, felt different coming from her. Less like a partnership. More like a structure I didn't fully control. I tried again. What about the house? I asked. What about it? Whose name is it under? She didn't hesitate. Mine. Just like that. No explanation. No hesitation. Just an answer. I nodded, even though my chest felt tight. And the car? I asked. Same response. Mine. It wasn't said to hurt me. It was said like a fact that had always been true. Which, in a way, it had been. I just hadn't paid attention. I could feel the conversation slipping away from me, but I didn't know how to hold on to it. Because every question I asked led to the same place. A place where I didn't have leverage. Where I didn't have clarity. Where I didn't even have a starting point. You're overthinking this, she said, standing up like the conversation was already over. Everything's fine. Fine. That word stayed with me. Because for her, it was. Nothing about her life had been disrupted. She still had control of everything. Still moved through it without hesitation. And now I understood why. It wasn't just that she'd hidden something from me. It was that she'd built everything in a way that didn't require me. Or consider what would happen if I ever tried to step outside of it. I sat there for a long time after she walked away. Not angry. Not even surprised anymore. Just, aware. Aware that leaving wasn't just a decision. It was a problem I didn't have the tools to solve. And the worst part wasn't realizing what she'd done. It was realizing how long it had taken me to see it. Because by the time I finally understood the structure I was living in, I wasn't sure I had a way out of it. After that conversation, nothing changed. At least, not on the surface. She moved through the house the same way she always had. Calm. Efficient. Unbothered. If anything, she seemed even more settled, like everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. And I stayed. That was the part one had the hardest time accepting. I didn't leave. I didn't push harder. I didn't force anything to shift. I just stayed in it. The routines continued. Mornings, evenings, the same shared spaces. We still sat across from each other, still spoke about ordinary things. Work. Plans. Small, meaningless updates that filled the silence. But it all felt staged. Like we were both playing roles in something that had already ended, but no one had said it out loud yet. I started noticing how carefully I moved through everything. Not physically. Emotionally. What I said. What I didn't say. What I chose to ignore. It wasn't a conscious decision at first. It just felt easier to avoid anything that might lead back to that same wall. Because I already knew what was on the other side of it. Nothing. No answers. No accountability. Just that same quiet dismissal. So I stopped trying to get anything from her. Stopped asking questions. Stopped expecting explanations. And in a strange way, that made things feel even more distant. She didn't have to hide anything anymore. There was nothing to push against. I think that's when it shifted from something I was reacting to something I was living inside. The betrayal wasn't a moment anymore. It was the environment. It was in the silence between conversations. In the way I avoided looking too closely at certain things. In the way I stopped checking, even when I knew I could. Because what would it change? Knowing more wouldn't give me options. It would just make everything heavier. There were times I'd sit there and try to imagine what it would look like to disrupt everything. To force a change. To walk away, even without a plan. But those thoughts never lasted long. They always ran into the same reality. I didn't have control over anything that made leaving possible. Not in a way that felt real. And she knew that. Not because she said it again. But because she didn't have to. That confidence, quiet, unspoken, was always there. It showed up in the way she carried on like nothing had shifted. Like whatever I had realized, didn't matter. I started to feel smaller in my own life. Not in an obvious way. Just, less present. Like I was existing around things instead of inside them. Decisions happened without me. Movements continued without my input. Even the space I lived in didn't feel like something I had any claim to anymore. I was just there. And the hardest part wasn't the anger, or even the betrayal itself. It was the realization that none of it required anything from me. Not my approval. Not my reaction. Nothing. I could stay quiet, and everything would continue exactly the same. I could speak up, and it still wouldn't change anything that mattered. That's when it really settled in. This wasn't just about what she'd done. It was about where that left me. And the answer to that felt harder to face than anything else. Because the longer I stayed, the more it started to feel like this wasn't something I was trapped in. But something I was allowing to continue. There wasn't a single moment where everything flipped. No big decision. No sudden surge of confidence. If anything, it started in a way that felt almost insignificant. I stopped trying to make it make sense. That was the first shift. Up until then, I'd been stuck in this loop, replaying things, analyzing them, trying to figure out where it went wrong or what I should have done differently. But none of that was changing anything. It wasn't giving me answers. It was just keeping me in place. So I let it go. Not the situation itself. Just the need to understand it in a way that made it easier to accept. Because I realized something I hadn't fully admitted to myself before. It didn't make sense. And it wasn't supposed to. The way things were set up, the way everything had been handled, it wasn't built around fairness or balance. It was built around control. And I had adapted to that without questioning it. That part was hard to sit with. Not because I blamed myself for what happened, but because I could see how I'd adjusted, step by step, without noticing what I was giving up along the way. That awareness didn't fix anything. But it changed how I saw it. I stopped looking at it like something I had to endure. And started looking at it like something I had to move through. Even if I didn't know how yet. That's when I started paying attention again, but differently this time. Not to her. To myself. What I was thinking. What I was avoiding. What I'd been telling myself just to keep things steady. I noticed how often I dismissed my own reactions. How quickly I backed down from my own questions. How easily I convinced myself that something wasn't worth pushing, even when it clearly was. That pattern didn't come from nowhere. I'd learned it inside this situation. And realizing that made something else clear. If I'd learned it, I could unlearn it. That didn't mean everything changed overnight. It didn't. I was still in the same place. Still dealing with the same limitations. Nothing about the structure around me had shifted. But internally, something had. I stopped seeing myself as stuck in something permanent. That idea started to loosen. Not disappear. Just loosen. I began separating who I was from what I was in. That was new. Before, everything felt tied together, my identity, my role, my place in that house. It all felt fixed, like stepping outside of it wasn't even an option. Now, it felt less absolute. Still complicated. Still difficult. But not final. I started thinking differently about what control actually meant. Not the big, obvious things, money, ownership, access. But the smaller ones. What I chose to accept. What I chose to ignore. What I allowed to continue without questioning it. Those things were still mine. Even if everything else wasn't. And once I saw that, it became harder to go back to the way I'd been moving through things before. I didn't confront her. I didn't make any dramatic moves. But I stopped shrinking around the situation. Stopped adjusting myself to fit into something that clearly wasn't built for me. That shift was quiet. No one else would have noticed it. But I did. And it changed how everything felt. For the first time since I'd put the pieces together, I wasn't just reacting to what was happening. I was aware of it. Fully. And that awareness came with something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not control. Not yet. But the sense that maybe, eventually, I wouldn't be standing in the same place forever. When I look back on everything now, the part that stands out isn't just what she did. It's how it was able to exist the way it did. The cheating hurt. There's no way around that. It changed how I saw her, how I saw us, how I understood everything we had built together. But that wasn't the part that stayed with me the longest. What stayed was the realization that I didn't have a way out when I first needed one. That I couldn't just leave. Not because I didn't want to. Because I couldn't. And that changes things. It changes how you think about trust. Because trust, at least the way I understood it back then, was about believing someone wouldn't hurt you. But I never considered what would happen if they did, and I didn't have the ability to step away. That part never crossed my mind. I thought giving up control in certain areas was just part of building something together. That it meant things were stable. Secure. That it meant we were aligned. I didn't think about what it meant to not have access. To not have visibility. To not have options. And maybe that's the part one struggle with the most now. Trying to figure out where that line actually is. When does trust stop being trust? And start becoming dependence? Because it doesn't feel dangerous at the time. It feels efficient. It feels easier. It feels like you're building something stronger because you're not pulling in different directions. But if one person holds everything together, what happens when they decide you're no longer part of it? Or worse. When they never really needed you to begin with? That's the question I keep coming back to. Not just about what happened to me, but about how easily something like that can take shape without you noticing. Because it didn't feel like I was giving anything up. Not in the moment. It felt like I was trusting the person I was with. And maybe that's what makes it so hard to see while you're inside it. You don't recognize the loss while it's happening. Only when you try to take something back. And realize it was never really yours anymore. So I don't know what the right answer is. I don't know where the exact line should be. But I know this. If you had to choose between trusting someone completely, or making sure you always have a way to walk away, which one would you protect more? If stories like this make you stop and think, subscribe to Cheating Stories with Ray for more real-life situations that go deeper than they seem at first. Like the video if this one stuck with you, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. And in the comments, I want to know. At what point do you think trust becomes something else entirely?